I'll introduce myself. My name is Ted Peterson. I'm the Director of Student Media here. I'm an Associate Professor of Communication and Journalism here at Florida Tech and advisor to the student newspaper. We've been doing Free Speech Week. It started out as Free Speech Day, but now it's turned into Free Speech Week. This is our 10th year of doing it. And the whole event came about because after I'd been advisor for maybe about 6 months at the Crimson, I finally read the Constitution to the student media governing document, the student media constitution. Should have read that a lot sooner, but I found this passage in it that said, freedom of the press as guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States is not blocked or interfered with by Florida Tech or any of its trustees, administrators, faculty, or staff. And so when I read that, I thought, man, everybody needs to know this. My students need to know this. The rest of the student body needs to know this. And very importantly, the administration, faculty, staff, and trustees need to know this. So I thought, let's have a celebration of the fact that the Crimson does operate as a free press, and that students should know that the things that go into the Crimson and all student media really are there because the student leaders want it there. And the things that don't go into the Crimson aren't there because the student leaders thought it didn't need to be there. It's up to them and their decision. And I think that's really important. So we've been doing this now for 10 years. We're obviously doing this differently this year than in the past. We're not going to be handing out pizza and we're not going to be gathering in the same kind of spaces, but I'm really excited for what we've got. Before I get too far along, I want to introduce Sonia Michaels. She is editor-in-chief of the Crimson and is going to be helping me with this conversation with Joe. I think it's, I'll encourage you guys to watch this however you want. I'm probably going to switch to the speaker view so that that Joe is big and the boxes of the attendees are little. Right now, everybody should probably be on mute. I think as you entered, you're on mute. There will be time for some question and answer, and at that point, I'll allow anybody to unmute, and we'll kind of see how that goes. It could be a little bit of a free-for-all, but we'll see what happens there. And of course, the chat is open. We'll try to do our best there, but this is relatively new territory for all of us, so please be patient with us. So today is one of those rare opportunities where you get to see the face of someone that you may have been listening to for a long time. And I always enjoy those moments. And today is one of them. So we've got Joe Palca. He's a science correspondent for NPR. He's been with them since 1992. And he's covered a range of topics, science topics, everything from biomedical research to astronomy. He's the founder of NPR SciCommers, which is a science communication collective. I love that. I think that's so important for that kind of idea at a university like ours. He began his journalism career in television and then later print. He worked for Nature and for Science magazine. He's won numerous awards. I'll just list a couple of them: National Academy's Communication Award, American Association for the Advancement of Science Journalism Prize, and the Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Writing. In 2019, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences for outstanding achievement in journalism, and he wrote a book that I kind of want my children to read. It's called Knowing the Science of What Bugs Us, and I think that would be useful, at least for our household. And on Zoom, of course, I have no idea if my jokes land, so I assume you're all chuckling and humored by that. He comes to journalism from a science background. He's got a PhD. He's actually Dr. Palca from the University of California in Santa Cruz, and he worked on human sleep physiology. So with that, we won't do the applause that we normally would I did get a laugh emoji from Dr. Edwards. I'll open it up. Joe, how did you end up in journalism after starting your career in science?
Oh, who remembers? It was so long ago. Since I get to tell it, it's my origin story, but it's probably a little more complicated than what I've been telling people and when I give talks. I was on the student paper in college as well. I actually rose to the rank of sports editor. um, where I had what I considered to be one of my best headlines ever, which was disappointing season ends in disappointment. was probably the sports people didn't appreciate it, but I thought it was nice. So I kind of flirted with journalism. I was never really very interested in news. I liked sports, and I liked criticism. You know, I tried writing a criticism of a concert, and I got blasted by everybody in the concert hall. So I decided I'd stop that. But that was in college, and then for some strange reason, I decided I wanted to go to medical school, and so I hadn't taken any pre-med courses, so I went back to college to take all of those, and then I applied to medical school, and I took a job as a lab technician. And this is just a very unlikely aside, but it sort of talks about things that happen to you that you don't really expect to happen. So I was living in San Diego because I had done my post-baccalaureate undergraduate work to finish my pre-med stuff at UC San Diego. And I got this job as a lab technician, which was a joke because I was terrible in the lab. I don't know, maybe, I don't know, they hired me. I was a friend of a friend. And so this guy that I worked for, he was a real interesting guy. He loved outlaw cowboy music, loved Willie Nelson, Jerry Jeff Walker, those kinds of guys. And we used to have a good time. We worked really hard all day, and we would go out drinking and having pizza at night, and just had a spectacularly fun year. The reason I bring it up is that 2 years ago, the guy I was working for won the Nobel Prize in medicine for discovering these checkpoint inhibitors, which he wasn't working on when I was working with him. But you know, wow, I certainly, you know, none of us were thinking, oh, here's a Nobel Prize winning scientist I get to work for. We were just thinking, this guy's great fun and he's fun to work with. So I guess there's that. I think that element of serendipity is important. I mean, what happened there didn't happen to everybody, but it did, something like that did happen in my in my professional career. So anyway, I didn't get into medical school. That was probably, was hard to take at the time, but somebody was watching over me, because I'm really glad I didn't get into medical school. I wound up going to graduate school. As you heard, I studied sleep research. I was very interested in sleep for all sorts of interesting reasons, but at the end of 4 years, I didn't really feel like a research career was something I wanted to do, but I didn't really have another plan. And I was sitting in my office reading Science magazine one day when there was a picture of, I don't know if you've seen these, there's always these pictures of a group of people in Washington, D.C., and they're all smiling and they're standing in front of a marble building, and it says, this is this year's crop of so-and-sos, whatever they are. And this crop was the AAAS Mass Media Science and Engineering Fellows Program, which was a program which still runs today, where they take people who are interested in science, communication, or journalism, and they say, okay, for 10 weeks, we'll put you into a news place. So it could be newspaper, it could be radio, it could be television, no online in those days. But I applied and I got it. And so it was really like, there's this story of the guy who doesn't know what instrument he wants to play in the orchestra, and finally they make him the conductor, and then he's happy. So I felt like I'd suddenly been made the conductor, because I wasn't sure what science I wanted to do, but I sure liked talking about it and reporting on it. And so that was for me. I came back to Santa Cruz, where I was doing my PhD, determined to become a science journalist. Okay, so I finished my dissertation so that my mother could be proud of me, and got my PhD. And then what? You know, I had 10 weeks of experience as basically an intern at a TV station in Washington, D.C., and I'm living in San Francisco. So this is where I tell a lot of graduate students that graduate school isn't just about learning one topic really, really, really well. It's about learning how to solve problems and get information. And so I had a starting condition and an ending condition, and I had to figure out how to get from one to the other. And it was a challenge. I mean, I wrote lots and lots of letters, and I made lots and lots of phone calls, and I pestered people at the CBS station in San Francisco because I was at the CBS station in Washington, D.C. That's where they put me for the summer. That's the Washington connection to my life. I didn't want to go to Washington. I wanted to stay in San Francisco, but they said, go to Washington for this fellowship. And I said, okay. So anyway, I just kept banging on doors in San Francisco. And finally someone said, well, you know, the entry level job here is vacation relief writer for the local TV station. And I said, well, how do you get that? And they said, well, you take the writing test. And I said, well, they wouldn't give me the writing test. They said I didn't have enough experience. And they said, oh, they'll give the writing test to anybody. And so she said, call this person, I call them. They said, okay, come in tomorrow. That was like on a Thursday. Well, it turns out that during the summer, one of the things I'd been doing to prepare was recording the nightly news and then transcribing it and then looking at the structure of it. And then I would rewrite articles out of the San Francisco Chronicle in the format of the local news. So the writing test, when I got to place on Friday afternoon or Friday morning, or maybe it was Thursday anyway, was basically that. It was wire copy, and they said, write this as if you're going to be broadcasting. And apparently I did okay, because I got a call later that day or the next day saying, can you come in Monday? And so suddenly, with zero experience, because I couldn't do any writing at the TV station I was at because it was a union shop and I wasn't in the union. So with zero professional experience, I was writing the 5 o'clock news for the #1 station in the 5th largest market in the country. And that's just insane, but you know, you try. So I did that. And then through circumstances that were too, somebody in Washington offered me a job. And so it was a crappy job, but I took it and I went to Washington temporarily in 1982. And so I wound up working there. And then in 1985, I had left there and then come back, but I got a call one day as I was sitting at my desk, and it was the editor of Nature magazine. And he said, how would you like to come to work for us? And I'm thinking to myself, how the heck did the editor of Nature magazine decide to call me at a local television station? And again, there's an explanation, but it was one of those serendipity things. So I said, okay, I'll do that. And I left local television news for Nature magazine for 3.5 years. And then I got traded to Science for a future draft pick. And then I had what they call artistic differences with my editor at Science. And so in order to get out of there, I took a temporary job and a pay cut to come to NPR. And the job was for 1 year, and I was making about $5,000 less a year. But it seemed like a better deal. Anyway, I took it, and well, again, I guess you could say I've written to the level of my incompetence, because one way to look at it is I've been in the same dead-end job for 28 years. But at the same time, it's been a pretty interesting 28 years. So that's the origin story. Don't think anybody could tread that path again. People always want to know, how did you do this? And I said, well, I'll tell you, but it's not going to help you much. The only thing that's helping is the persistence, I think, is one thing that I tell people. And also to be creative about what you're willing to do. I figured when I started out that I wanted to be a TV science correspondent. That was my goal, or TV producer of science. But I realized I didn't have any experience in television, so I wanted to take a job that would give me experience in television, so that when the next job came along that had something to do with science, I could say, yeah, I know how to do that. I know how to do that. And so, again, it's like problem solving that you learn to do when you're setting up an experiment and the vacuum cleaner motor needs to be replaced. And so you learn how to be a vacuum cleaner repairman. it's all on the job. The one thing that I did like a lot about graduate school was teaching. And I really like that. And I think that also plays into why I like being a journalist, because I don't think of myself as an educator. That I don't do. And we can talk about that if you want. But I do think of myself as a communicator, and I'm trying to make things that are complicated understandable. And that part of my job really, really delights me. So is that a long enough answer?
That is. I just want to say, Sonia, I think we'll ask the follow-up, but I love the grit and determination to. I'm just going to transcribe this to figure out the style. I think that's such a great lesson for all of us to learn. So, Sonia.
So how do you think that things might be different now for a student who feels like they're kind of on a similar path to you? Like maybe you could speak a little bit more on the artistic differences that you had mentioned and how a student now could handle things like that.
Oh, well, the artistic differences were mostly, well, I mean, to put it, if that had been my first job and I had no options, I would have stayed there because I was loving the job. And every single job I've ever had at any time has a frustration attached to it, something that you would really like to change. And I've always thought that, well, you have to decide, is this one of, I guess it's true for marriage too. Is this a non-starter? Is this so awful that I have to change my circumstances? And the answer most of the time is no. You just have to learn to live with it. Occasionally it's yes. So in terms of starting out, I think the answer is learn to live with it no matter what. I mean, unless they're asking you to do something that's morally reprehensible, in which case I would leave holding my head high. But I'm happy to say I never worried where my next meal was going to come from, and so the ability to say, "I won't do that, sir," was always there. And again, I have I'd like to say it's because I'm so good, but I think it's more because I'm so privileged. I'd like to say, oh, I always knew I'd get something, and I have. But I think in the beginning, my willingness to bend would be a lot greater. The trouble with starting out now, as far as I can tell, is not finding work, because there's plenty of work. It's just finding work that pays. And one of the things that we've been wrestling with at NPR is we barely pay interns a living wage, and you're basically saying, if you're privileged and rich, you can come to work for NPR as an intern, and it's really great. And that doesn't exactly breed diversity. So that's a problem.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Absolutely.
That's interesting. I'm curious about, so you worked in television, and then you worked in print, and now you work in audio. And what are some of the similarities between broadcast and print journalism? And then what are some of the differences and challenges that you face telling stories just in audio?
Well, people in audio always like to say the line is, I like audio better than TV because the pictures are better. And that is, before you saw me, I could have been tall, dark, and handsome. And now whatever I am because you've seen me. So if I describe something and I do it well and it's appealing to you, it can be you can conjure up anything in your mind that you like, and it can be as attractive or as unattractive as you prefer. But at the same time, I don't believe that audio is always better. And for me, the example is the iconic picture, unfortunately, we were talking about launches of 1986 when the Challenger blew up. And you could talk about that till you're blue in the face, but when you see that picture of the rocket trails tailing off and the boosters falling away. Words, first of all, words aren't necessary. And second of all, I don't have the words that would adequately convey the horror and terribleness of that. So that's one thing, but there's a universality in telling stories. I mean, it's funny in a way, people also think, they say, oh, well, I've got this really interesting sound in my lab of this machine that goes bing. And I go, what does that mean to people? I mean, it doesn't, that's not a reason to cover a story because there's a machine that makes an interesting noise. The reason to cover a story is an interesting story. And so I say that radio is not about sound. It's about story. I do that just to piss off my producer. But she knows that if you could place somebody in a place and tell a story, it's much richer. But if you just find a place with interesting sound and no story, it gets boring. And unless you've got the world's finest sound engineers and you're in a rainforest with amazing sounds, and even then I think it gets boring. I mean, it's soothing and you might want to fall asleep or imagine a giant animal is slithering toward you or something. But I think telling a story, and there's the same, and it's just you have to tell the story in the way that the format allows. So one of the things I liked the least about television is that you had to have a picture. And there are interstitial moments where you go from what somebody here is saying to what somebody there is saying, and there's really no sensible picture to go. So every single television show that I've ever seen about science at some point has a scientist walking down the hall or a scientist holding a gel up to the ceiling to look at it. It doesn't convey any information whatsoever. It's just a picture to keep you looking at the screen while you tell the story. And so that's one of the things I hated about television and love about radio. You can do without those nonsensical, time-consuming, pointless video shots and just tell the story. And in print, the other thing is, if you did a transcript of this talk that I'm giving, I think you, having been here, you would read it and you would say, it doesn't capture everything that the live performance did, right? You don't hear the energy in my voice. You don't hear the passion. You don't hear the inflection. You don't hear me making a snide comment that it reads like a normal comment. Because in print, that doesn't come across. But in radio or audio, it does. And that's why I like audio so much. I mean, you can hear you can hear people who sound sincere. And unfortunately, if you can fake sincerity, you've got it made, because people like sincerity, I think. But anyway, that's why I like radio, and I like it better than print. Print lets you, use clever turns of phrase and words that you could never. Somebody wrote to me today that he was looking forward to abbuxinating the landing on Mars tomorrow. And abbuxinate, which I had to look up, means to trumpet. So, and the joke is, first of all, he's a big engineer at JPL. And the other joke is that he's a trumpeter. So it's not surprising that he was sending me that.
Sonia.
So what is your day like at NPR? How has it changed during the pandemic?
I haven't been to NPR since March 14th.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. It's I just wrote a piece. I'll read you the ending because it speaks to your question. I got vaccinated recently with the COVID-19, and so I said, so now I wrote a little first person story about what it was like, and I wrote, so now I'm fully vaccinated, but for the moment, NPR wants everyone who can to continue to work from home. So I'll be staying here in my basement storeroom, home studio. I mean, if I turn you can see that I'm fully stocked with toilet paper and stuff like that. But the typical day used to be, and it still is, a ton for some reason of emails that have to be looked at and answered and discussed and thought about. And then like today was like insanely busy because I'm covering the Mars landing, which is tomorrow. There were 2 press conferences this afternoon. There was our morning meeting, which is at 9:30, where we talk about stuff. And there was tape. I had to get tape ready for this thing I'm doing on Morning Edition tomorrow morning. And I don't like to get up at 4 a.m. and have to write my story. So I write it the night before. So I had to find that. And yeah, so today was just super busy, but mostly it's sitting in the office. I mean, the only thing that made going in necessary was that we would go into a real studio, and the sound quality was better coming out of the studio. But really, it's astounding to me, the internet. I mean, I haven't held a microphone in front of anybody to do an interview in a year, and yet I've been able, using Zoom and FaceTime and GoToMeeting and all these other things, to get really pretty decent audio out of people. And so that's been a major revelation. I mean, I was tempted. I didn't do it. Maybe I should, just so you can hear. But I'm using the microphone in the webcam, but I have my microphone I use for work over here, and I can set it up to go into the computer so that I can use it over Zoom. And it just sounds so much better. It's amazing. And so the audio it's been a real joy to be able to get decent audio without going anywhere. And I've also, I wanted to see what it was like to manufacture a vaccine. And so they wouldn't let me into the plant, and it was before there was a vaccine. So they held their cell phone up and showed me the steps in the process. And I just watched, and they narrated, and then I did a version of that for air. I thought that worked out pretty well too.
It's all very interesting.
It seems to me that even just the sound of radio produced in March and April, when we were all figuring this out, you could tell people were at home, and I think reporters have just adapted, and it's harder and harder to tell whether someone's working from home based on the audio quality. So, all right, 2020 was a crazy year for science. We've had a pandemic. We had, wildfires and hurricanes and all sorts of things. What were some of the memorable stories, and what was it like to cover the year of 2020?
Well, almost all of my year has been spent on COVID. I mean, I wouldn't say that the science desk everywhere, they're not an afterthought, but they're not being hounded by the shows. Can you get us this? Can you get us that? Can you go on here? Can you do this? I mean, last year I had more stories on the air than I think I have had in a decade. But they were, 85% of them were about COVID in one way or another, and only a very, very few were not. And from that point of view, again, it's such an interesting science question. but it's that in a way, it's easy for me at least to forget that it's a deadly disease. And one of the things, and I don't know if we're going to get into this or not, but one of the things that was getting increasingly difficult for me was this notion that people thought I was lying about stuff or making it up, or that I was fake news and there was no vaccine, or the vaccine, was going to. I wasn't telling people that Bill Gates had put a microchip in the vaccine, and I'm part of a conspiracy not to let the American people know that they're going to be taken over. And I used to feel like I could ignore that stuff because it was so obviously wrong and fringy, that it was easily ignorable. And then all of a sudden it was like, it seemed front and center, and people in power were endorsing stuff like this. And I found that very difficult. I continue to find it difficult because people say to me, well, how do we convince people to take the vaccine? And I said, well, I've got no idea. I mean, if you have doubts, okay, if you have a hyperimmune reaction to polyethylene glycol, then yeah, okay, I understand why you're a little nervous, because the vaccine has polyethylene glycol in it. But short of that, I mean, yeah, you can, it's a risk calculation, but you're not going to, most likely, nobody yet has died directly as a consequence of the vaccine. I mean, they may in 20 years, but that's always a possibility, and we'd never be able to answer that question. So I don't understand from a scientific standpoint what the problem is. Has it been adequately tested? Well, maybe not. I mean, I'm sure that everybody would prefer to have more testing, but we're in a strange circumstance, and it's just a question of where you hold the bar. I mean, Paul Offit, who's at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, says you never get to perfection. You're always making some sort of compromise. Well, we'd like to know this, but this is good enough. And the point is that good enough is not a fixed point. It's a relative point. And actually, I want to anticipate other questions, because there's also these questions about how do I cover, controversial topics like embryonic stem cells, which I spent a year covering, or fetal tissue research, or climate change. And I always say that the answer from that point of view is there's no controversy in the scientific community. That's not where the problem is. It's a cultural controversy. And okay, I don't have to cover, I have to be aware of cultural controversies, but that's not my beat. But the problem for me is that if you say abortion is murder, full stop, no exceptions, can't do it, not happening. I mean, that's an opinion. I don't see where a scientist can convince somebody that that's not a valid belief. But then I also wonder whether I should tell people that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is grown in cells that were originally harvested from the retina of an aborted fetus. And do they want to know that? Would they then say, well, I don't want that vaccine? Maybe. Okay. Certainly, if you're opposed to abortion, it would seem a little weird to be taking a vaccine that was made from aborted fetal tissue. So the other question, Sonia, is whether I should be telling people this. Or are you going to do a story in your newspaper about it?
That is the question.
Yeah.
I want to know more about how you take these, not necessarily controversial, as you said, from a scientific standpoint, but complicated or just so full of information types of topics, and how do you make that accessible and consumable to the public that's listening?
Well, one of the things you have to do is leave a lot of stuff out. And so, so scientists like to say, you've dumbed down my research. If I don't put in all the caveats and question marks and point of view, and I say to them, look, if I can give full analysis of your research in 3.5 minutes, you haven't accomplished very much in your life. So the answer is we're talking in different modes of communication. And so every time you think of something complicated, you have to back out and think, well, first of all, why am I telling you this at all? And then second of all, what part of it do you most need to know about? And so the example I give is CRISPR-Cas9. Have you heard of that?
I have not.
So CRISPR-Cas9 is a system that was discovered in 2012. And what it does is very complicated. But what it accomplishes is very easy, because all it does is it goes into a living cell, finds the DNA in that cell, makes a cut in it, and takes a little bit of that DNA away, or in some cases adds a little bit to it. But it's in a living cell. So in a way, you can think of it as a word editor for editing DNA. And since DNA has the genes, and if you edit the genes, you're editing that organism. Okay, that's CRISPR. It took me 6 months to figure out how to explain that, because I did not understand CRISPR. I still don't really understand CRISPR. But now I understand the metaphor that CRISPR is. And all people who need to know about, all people who aren't biochemists or molecular geneticists or something like that need to know about CRISPR is what I just told you. It can cut the DNA in living cells. And then we get to one other level of abstraction, which is there's two different kinds of cells in our body. One are called germ cells, which is a terrible name because people think germ means something else, but it means a cell that's either an egg or a sperm and has just a single strand of DNA, so that when they come together, they're double-stranded and they actually get parts from one parent and parts from another parent, and that's how diversity comes about, but that's how sexual reproduction takes place. Germ cells are passed to the next generation by this sexual reproduction. Somatic cells, which are every other cell in the body, don't. So if I alter a somatic cell in your body, it's only going to affect you, and it's not going to affect any offspring you might have. So that's where the debate about CRISPR has gotten all hot and bothered, because can I edit embryos? Well, the answer is, yeah, you probably can. So then the question is, well, should I? That's a good question. We should talk about that. If you want to eliminate a universally fatal childhood disease, I don't know. If you want to make somebody run faster, I don't think that's so good. I don't know that anybody knows how to do that genetically, but if they did, I don't think it would be such a good idea to be monkeying around with our genes for that. So that's what I do with complicated topics, is I try to back out as far as I can to the bigger picture. And the story that I did like 2 years ago that really captured that for me was I was trying to do something about the electric dipole moment of the neutron, which is about as obscure a topic as I have ever tackled in my entire life. And I don't even quite understand what the electron dipole moment of a neutron is, but it has, I know what a neutron is. That's a little thing inside an atom. But the idea is that it may be that the charge of a neutron, which is balanced between positive and negative, that's why it comes out neutral, is slightly off-centered. And that's the dipole moment. And what do we care about that? Well, it turns out that in order for the universe to exist, there has to be something called a violation of symmetry. Because when the universe started, there was matter and there was antimatter. And if there were equal amounts of both, they would have just come together and all the universe would be was a bright flash. And then we'd all be gone. That would be it. But there had to be a little bit more matter than antimatter for the world to exist. And it turns out, for reasons which I will simply wave my hands and hope that you don't ask me any questions about, that if there is this symmetry violation, it will show up in the electric dipole moment of the neutron, if you could measure it. And so far, nobody's been able to. Now, the way I started that story was why corned beef sandwiches and the rest of the universe exists. And the picture on the web page for that story had this giant, really tasty looking corned beef sandwich. And it got more hits. It got like 175,000 hits. Mostly because I was trying to make the point that this is a story that is so fundamental it affects everything. But if it affects everything, it's more than your head can get your head around. So let's start with something like a corned beef sandwich or a ham sandwich or whatever your preference is. Could have said pizza, but corned beef sandwich popped into my head. So that's the answer: is you back out to the place where you understand in your own mind what you want your audience to understand when you're done with your piece, and then you think, what's the least amount I can put in that will allow them to do that, the least number of facts, because facts are confusing.
It's great. Thank you for that.
Really interesting. If there are any of my students in here, they'll recognize the mantra of understanding your audience, right? Know your audience and who are you writing to. My question is, do you ever get any frustrated scientists that say you left out important pieces to this, and how do you handle that?
That's again, so there's a selection bias on my part. I think it's quite possible that the frustrated scientists don't call. But I have to say that one of the things that makes me really happy is how frequently the people I write about write to me and say, boy, you really nailed that. And in a way, I feel bad because I'm not writing it to make them happy. I'm writing it to explain to people. But it makes me very happy that the person that I was trying to capture and explain feels like I did a good job. And so it feels like in my career that I have not, and I don't think I probably have had a few and have suppressed them, but I really don't get any appreciable number of people calling up and yelling at me. Again, maybe they're intimidated or something. But...
Well, I'll maybe ask one more question, Sonia, if you've got another one after that, and then I want to make sure we have opportunity for those of you guys watching to ask a question. What do you think is next for NPR? I think radio is such an interesting format that has survived when we always think it should go away, and in fact, in many ways, is thriving. What do you see as the future of radio journalism?
It's going to be some version of podcasting. When the iPod came out, everybody declared radio dead. And this was 10 or 12 or 15 years ago, terrestrial broadcast radio. And then when satellite radio came out, they did it again. And then, it's been declared dead a number of times. But I remember taking the metro to work and seeing all these people with earbuds and thinking, well, they're listening to something. And so I think NPR they've learned one thing, and they haven't learned another. This is my opinion. They've certainly learned that podcasts are real and important, and they're doing some spectacularly good ones. What I don't think they've understood is that there is an opportunity for radio on demand. And by that, I mean, let's say for some very peculiar reason, you would like to hear all my stories. And you like to know when I have a new one on the air, because you don't listen all the time and you might miss one. You could pop my name into your podcast player, and just like an update when there's a when a new podcast drops, you'd get a notification, Joe's got a story. And I have argued that this is something that should be available, not that I'm going to take over the world and that everybody's going to start listening to me. And it's probably not even sure that it's monetizable, although it might be. But NPR's answer to that is, well, they can go on the website and click on your profile and then click on, and I'm going, they could, but that's not how people consume audio anymore, if ever. And so why not think of your podcast player simply as a jukebox where you can dial up a podcast that you really like, or dial up a person that you really like, or something, and never mind what is a podcast. Because I don't know still what a podcast is. Usually they're very personality driven. People have said, why don't you do a podcast? And I'm going, well, I don't know. What would I do differently? Anyway, there's your answer. So I don't know. I think NPR's future is tied up in that world, and I think they'll figure it out, or they won't. But there's certainly a lot of really cool stuff to listen to that I like. But I also turn the radio on every night while I'm cooking dinner. So,
Sonia.
Before we move to questions, I did want to touch on misinformation and kind of how you decide when it's the right time to just ignore that kind of misinformation, or when you need to really address it and actively say, like, this is wrong, or this is incorrect, and this is the truth.
yeah, it's a constant debate. I mean, do we give oxygen to a stupid idea because it's circulating? I don't have a hard answer to that. What I wish is that I could let everybody know in our audience, hey, we didn't cover that, and there was a reason. There's a lot of things you don't hear on NPR because the science desk says that's nonsense. We're not going to touch that. But nobody knows that. They just don't hear it. So I wish there was some mechanism where I could say, no, bad. We don't think this is important or worth paying any attention to. There isn't that I know of. Although again, I think one of the things that people haven't been terribly creative about is new ways of using this medium of the internet. Maybe there is a way. Maybe there's a button. Maybe there's a something. I tried to get NPR to think about audio hypertexts, where if you were listening to something, you could press down on your podcast player when you heard something you wanted to learn more about, and all of a sudden you'd jump to that. And they said, oh, it's too hard. Well, okay, I'm an inspiration guy, not a perspiration guy, so I didn't know how to do it. But yeah, so I don't. There's no rule of thumb, but I think it's best to. My feeling is it's best to err on the side of don't say anything and hope it goes away. After a while, you'll know whether you were right or not. But I think there's a tendency to jump on things when you should just let them die quietly.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I'm gonna hit the button that will allow people to unmute. My with these kinds of things is that most of the time, one or two people will start speaking at the same time. One of them will win out. If you lose out, stay persistent and try again when there's another gap. But if you've got a question, I'll allow you to unmute and feel free to. Oops, I hit the wrong button. Okay, I believe you are now allowed to unmute. So if anybody's got any questions that they'd like to ask Joe.
I have a question. So when you're learning on a subject, like you said, a complicated issue, what sources do you typically rely on? Do you do interviews? Do you typically read publications? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So there's a lot of times when I read, so how do I decide? So I see an article that's coming out in Science magazine that looks intriguing, or if you want the electric dipole moment of the neutron, whatever. And I wouldn't understand the articles if I read, but you can usually make some sense out of the introduction and the discussion. And you can usually find somebody that's referenced in the introduction and discussion who said, you know, once upon a time, people thought this, which was clearly wrong. And then you find that person and go back to them and say, hey, this person says you're clearly wrong. Is that correct? And that person says, no, that person's wrong. And all of a sudden you're getting two perspectives on a story, which is useful. It helps you decide, you know, you're not going to solve the scientific argument, but at least you'll know what the key issues are that are involved. And so it's a mixture. I've discovered that I take in information very much through my ears as opposed to the printed page. So like people get really scared when they see my notes for doing a live radio thing because I keep it all in my head. And when they talk to me, I remember and I just, and anyway, I don't, I like to interview people because I ask the questions that I want to know the answers to. And maybe they're in the papers if I read the papers really carefully, but it's easier for me to just ask. So one of the things I say about learning to go from being a researcher to a journalist, or especially a graduate student to a journalist, is that, you know, when you're a graduate student and you want to learn something about DNA, you know, you go to the library, and or now you go to the internet. But when you're a journalist, you call the person who just won the Nobel Prize and say, hey, I don't understand this, and can you explain it to me? And sometimes they do. It's amazing the hubris of journalists. But yeah, it's a combination of things. And I mean, I look at press releases, anything that people have done to try to help me understand what I'm talking about is okay with me. At the end of the day, I guess the other thing is sort of having a spider sense, tingling, like, uh-oh, danger, something is missing here, or something doesn't seem right. Smell test, this is too pat, this is too something. And so after a while, that sensibility gets built up in good journalists, and they know where to ask, when to say something doesn't feel right here.
I have a question.
Yes.
Oh, okay, so as far as being a journalist, do you feel like it is more appealing to your audience when you use a logical approach or an emotional approach to the topic at hand?
That is one great question. So I feel that I am mostly constrained by logical. I'm not saying that emotional can't be fact driven, but letting the facts speak for themselves rather than trying to put an emotional twist on them is what I'm sort of taking from your question.
Yeah.
And I used to feel that I was enough to present just the facts, but I've been feeling in recent years that there's this school of journalism, or the school of science communication, called the information deficit model, where if we just explain things to people, they'll get it and they'll alter their behavior based on the information. And the answer now is the information deficit model is not enough. So going back to the example of, is Bill Gates putting microchips in vaccines? I could say that he's not and leave it at that, but I feel like I ought to do something more persuasive. And so to that extent, yeah, I feel that I think appealing to emotions is good, but it also means that you're now stepping out of the comfort zone of journalists. And part of the reason because we're not supposed to be using emotion and we're not supposed to be pushing people in one direction. I mean, here are the facts. There's no indication that there's a microchip in your vaccine. I mean, what's the other side? So, okay, then I've said it. So if that's not doing the trick, what else are we going to do? That's part of the reason that I'm worked on the psychomers, because I felt that the science communication that scientists did wasn't constrained by that need not to appeal to people's emotional side, emotional learning. And so, I feel like they can have at it, and it's important for them to be good communicators. So in a way, that's why I started that group. But it's a great question, and I'm not sure so it goes back actually to something that happened to me at Nature magazine. There was a story. I think it was Somalia, that these scientists or doctors who had come to America for education and then gone back to Somalia because they wanted to help their country. And at one point, the president of the country just rounded up like 12 of them and sentenced them all to death for insurrection or something. And I said I got a notification about this from some human rights group that was appalled, and this was science. So I asked the editor, I said, I can't write a news story about this. I mean, I don't see how. I think it was Siad Barre, if I'm remembering right, who was the president at the time. Anyway, and my editor said, well, write an editorial. I mean, you're allowed to have passions as a journalist, and you're allowed to expose things that are powerful and wrong. Anyway, great question. Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I have a question. So I've heard like a few times where scientists will get upset over journalists not really reporting on science topics correctly. Do you think that there's ever going to be a time where like there can be not a happy medium, but like where scientists will agree that journalists have gotten science topics right and covered them correctly?
Again, having emerged from the world of science, I think there's always going to be a tension between what a journalist does and what a scientist does. And I think what scientists have a hard time with is when they hear their words, taken out of context, because in a sense, I'm not describing everything that they're talking about. I'm only describing a small part, and I'm not putting in all the caveats. What they're thinking is, my chairman is going to hear this, or my biggest opponent in my field or something. They're going to hear this. They're going to think I'm an idiot. They're going to lambaste me for the things I didn't say, or the things I shorthanded or something. And that's going to make my life miserable. And I get that. But it's so unfair, because we're not talking in the same dynamic. And people have to realize that even the New York Times and even NPR and even these, top drawer, if I can say that, journalism places are still not the same as a journal article. It's just not. I mean, a peer-reviewed journal article, no, nobody peer reviews my reporting, and I might be getting some stuff wrong. I don't think I'm getting the important stuff wrong. So I think this was the idea behind the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship, was to sort of have scientists understand journalism and journalists understand science. And obviously it hasn't worked because you're asking the same question 30 years later. That's okay. I mean, it's still a good thing to try, or 40 years later, oh God. But so I don't think there's going to come a time when, oh, we've licked this. But I do think that scientists are beginning to have a better understanding of why it's important to leave stuff out and why we do it. It's not to embarrass them or to make them look stupid. It's to make them understandable.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think maybe we've got time for one more. We're right at about the hour mark. Anybody, any other questions?
Yeah, I actually do have two. Oh, so my first question is, how do you handle writer's block? Like, what are some things you do to get out of that? And the second question is, how do you handle a hostile or uncooperative interviewee?
Oh, well, the second one's easy. Well, they're both easy because I'm just so charming and lovable that nobody can resist talking to me for long. So I haven't been in a position where there are that many stories that I absolutely have to do that the scientist absolutely doesn't want to talk to me. So it doesn't come up that often. But when people are being, just taciturn and grouchy and unpleasant and uncooperative when I ask questions, and they're basically, well, that's a stupid question. I ask them personal questions about themselves. How'd you get into this field? Why are you doing this? Why'd you pick this topic? Why? What do you think in your field is what do you wish you could accomplish? I mean, something that takes them in a direction away from me seeming to be bothering them, and instead asking them questions that are not scientific at all, but that allow them to become something more than just, I don't know. It depends. I mean, there'll be people who'll be pissed off by that approach. You have to just figure at the moment what's going to work. Is charm going to work? Is humor going to work? Can you just say, look, I don't want to do this interview particularly, but I got to, and we can make this pleasant or unpleasant. And if you just give me a few quick answers, I'll be out of your hair. I mean, that's one way. So there's no great way, but you have to have lots and lots and lots and lots of ideas, because people, one thing, it's also always good to try to develop some sort of rapport with the person that you're talking to. I was talking to this person who said, my office is right across the street from New York Hospital in New York. I said, oh, really? I was born there. Okay. That had nothing to do with anything except for the fact that now we have this shared connection that she works across the street from the hospital I was born in. Doesn't mean anything except that it's a human connection. Sometimes those can make communication easier. And for writer's block, you're talking to the wrong person, because, knock on wood, I've never had it. I have a friend, Erica Good, wonderful writer. She edits something now called Inside Climate News. She worked at the New York Times for 20 years. She actually was in graduate school with me in Santa Cruz back in the late 70s and early 80s. Beautiful writer. And she called me the most unblocked writer she'd ever met. Because the only thing that gives me writer's block is when I can't reach the keyboard. It's so sad. I mean, I'm not the world's greatest writer, but I it doesn't happen. God, I say that, I'm wondering, if I'm tempting the gods by saying something like that, but it hasn't happened yet. I get up in the morning, I'm going to go on live tomorrow morning at 5:06 in the morning. And I think to myself, oh God, maybe this is the day when I just can't do it. It's all going to come out. It hasn't happened yet. So
Well,
I guess a little bit of fear is a good thing.
I'm going to ask one more question. Actually, I got it through a private chat, and I think it's a good one. In journalism, we're all about facts. We're all about getting things right. That's kind of the number one priority is accuracy. They say it's better to be right than to be first and wrong. And so the question that I got was, what is the biggest error you've ever made in your reporting, and what kind of steps do you take after you've done that to address the mistake?
Well, I think it's probably a healthy defense mechanism that I can't think of very many big mistakes that I've made. I made a lot of small ones. I mean, try explaining to the University of Michigan why you referred to them as Michigan State. Oh my God, they think that's like the end of the world. The only thing I guess the only thing is to remember that nobody dies mostly. I'm not doing brain surgery, so when I make a mistake, it's not going to end somebody's life. I don't die, they don't die. You just, issue an apology, issue a correction, issue whatever has to be done to correct the record and move on. But I wish I could tell you a juicy one. I'll have to think about that. But again, I say I think it's a sign of a well-adjusted reporter that he can't remember any of them. Or maybe I just remember the ones that were small enough to bear.
Well, Joe, thank you so much. I'm unmuted, so I'll applaud, and I know you guys at home are doing that as well.